If we're going to talk honestly about the pain of becoming yourself, we have to begin with compassion for the mask. Because the mask was not a failure of character. It was not weakness. It was adaptation. No child wakes up one morning and decides to become false. What happens instead is far more subtle and far more intelligent. A child enters the world wired for two essential needs: attachment and authenticity. Attachment is the need to belong, to be held, to be protected. Authenticity is the need to feel and express what is true inside. In a healthy environment, those two can coexist. But in many environments, even loving ones, they collide. If expressing anger leads to withdrawal, the child learns to suppress anger. If sadness overwhelms a parent, the child learns to hide tears. If being too much results in criticism, the child becomes smaller. This isn't manipulation. It's survival. The nervous system of a child cannot afford rejection. Attachment is life. So when authenticity threatens attachment, authenticity is sacrificed. Not consciously, automatically. The body makes the calculation long before the mind can form the words. Who do I need to be to stay loved? Who must I not be to stay safe? That is the origin of the mask. And here's the important part. At the time, it works. The compliant child gets approval. The high achiever earns praise. The caretaker maintains harmony. The quiet one avoids conflict. The mask preserves connection. It reduces danger. It increases belonging. In that sense, it is brilliant. But what begins as protection gradually becomes identity. You don't just act agreeable. You become the easy one. You don't just perform well. You become the responsible one. You don't just suppress needs. You become low maintenance. And over time, you lose access to the spontaneous self underneath. Not because it disappeared, but because it was never given safe space to breathe. This is why dropping the mask later in life feels so threatening. You're not just changing behavior. You're challenging a structure that once guaranteed survival. Your body still carries the memory. If I show this part of myself, I could lose love. So when adults begin to assert boundaries, speak uncomfortable truths, or admit vulnerability, they often feel guilt or fear. They interpret that anxiety as evidence they are doing something wrong. In reality, they are confronting an old attachment blueprint. The body is reacting to yesterday's danger, not today's reality. There's also grief here, because when you see clearly that your mask was built in response to unmet needs, you may begin to feel the sorrow of what you didn't receive. The unconditional acceptance, the permission to be messy, the space to express anger without exile. That grief can be profound. But grief is not pathology. It's recognition. When we understand that the mask was once necessary, we can approach it with gratitude rather than shame. Instead of saying, "Why did I pretend?" we begin to ask, "What was I protecting? What did I need?" That shift changes everything. Because the goal is not to violently tear the mask off. That only re-traumatizes the system. The goal is to gently reassure the nervous system that authenticity no longer equals abandonment. That you can survive disagreement. That you can tolerate disapproval. That connection built on performance is not true connection at all. And here's the paradox. The very strategy that once kept you safe may now be the source of your suffering. The mask that preserved attachment may now block intimacy. The compliance that avoided rejection may now prevent respect. What protected you then restricts you now. So the first step in becoming yourself is not rebellion. It's understanding. It's honoring the intelligence of the child who did what was necessary to survive. And then, slowly, carefully, choosing something different. The mask was never the enemy. It was a guardian that overstayed its welcome. And the moment you see that, you stop fighting yourself, and you begin coming home. Once you begin to understand that the mask was a survival strategy, something subtle starts to shift. You may feel a desire, perhaps a quiet, trembling desire, to live differently. To speak more honestly, to say no when you mean no, to stop smiling when something hurts. And yet, almost immediately, the pain begins. Because authenticity does not feel like freedom at first. It feels like loss. When you stop performing, some relationships begin to strain. The friend who relied on your endless availability may feel rejected when you set a boundary. The partner who was comfortable with your emotional restraint may feel unsettled when you start expressing anger or disappointment. The family system that functioned around your compliance may resist your differentiation. And this is where people often retreat. They think, Maybe I was better off the old way. Because the old way, however constricting, was predictable. It maintained harmony. It minimized conflict. But harmony built on self-erasure is not peace. It is quiet self-abandonment. Still, we must acknowledge the grief. When you begin to drop the mask, you may lose certain roles. You may lose the identity of being the strong one, the dependable one, the selfless one. And you may also lose people, at least the version of them that related to the version of you who performed. That hurts. It hurts to realize that some connections were conditional, that some affection was tied to your usefulness, that some approval was dependent on your silence. And the pain here is not just relational, it is existential. You are no longer sure who you are without the performance. There is often a period of profound disorientation. If I'm not constantly pleasing, who am I? If I'm not achieving to prove my worth, what defines me? If I'm not the caretaker, what is my role? This is not pathology. It is identity reorganization. The nervous system, which once equated belonging with safety, now interprets differentiation as threat. So when you assert yourself, you may feel anxiety. When you disappoint someone, you may feel guilt. When you choose yourself, you may feel selfish, even when your choice is healthy and reasonable. This is the internalized voice of early adaptation. It says, careful, if you stop performing, you will lose love. And sometimes you do lose something. But what you lose is not genuine love. It is attachment to a role. There is also a quieter grief, the grief of recognizing how long you have been disconnected from yourself. People often tell me that when they begin living more authentically, they feel sadness about the years spent hiding. They mourn the conversations they never had, the boundaries they never set, the desires they never pursued. But grief, again, is a sign of awakening. You cannot mourn what you cannot see. And once you see clearly, you cannot unsee. The paradox is that the pain of authenticity is evidence of growth. If nothing in your life is disrupted, you are probably still performing. Growth destabilizes. It exposes fault lines. It challenges unspoken contracts. It forces renegotiation internally and externally. And yet, beneath the loss, something else begins to emerge. A faint sense of solidity, a quiet relief. Even if others are uncomfortable, you begin to feel less divided inside. There is less monitoring, less self-editing, less calculation. You may tremble when you speak your truth, but you also feel real. This is the transition from external validation to internal alignment. The old self was organized around, will they accept me? The emerging self begins to ask, can I accept myself? That shift is seismic. It doesn't happen overnight, and it is rarely clean. There will be moments when you revert, when you apologize for things that require no apology, when you over-explain to soften your boundaries. That is not failure. It is the nervous system recalibrating. Authenticity is not a dramatic declaration. It is 1,000 small acts of honesty, each one slightly uncomfortable, each one slightly liberating. So yes, becoming yourself hurts. It disrupts. It disappoints. It dismantles illusions. But what it dismantles was never truly stable to begin with. And the pain you feel is not the pain of breaking. It is the pain of shedding what no longer fits. Freedom rarely arrives as euphoria. It often arrives as grief first. But if you can stay with that grief, without retreating into performance, you will discover something deeper than approval. You will discover integrity. And integrity, once tasted, is worth every loss. Now, as you begin to live more honestly, something confusing often happens. You make a simple decision. Perhaps you say no to a request, or you express disappointment, or you admit that you're hurt, and your body reacts as though you've stepped into danger. Your heart races. Your stomach tightens. There's a wave of anxiety, maybe even shame. And you think, why is this so hard? I'm just telling the truth. What we have to understand here is that authenticity is not only a psychological act, it is a biological event. The nervous system does not operate on logic. It operates on memory. And not just narrative memory, the kind you can consciously recall, but implicit memory. The body remembers tone of voice, facial expressions, withdrawal of affection, moments of humiliation. It remembers what happened the last time you expressed anger or need or disagreement. If, in your early environment, authenticity was met with rejection, criticism, or emotional distance, your nervous system made an association. Self-expression equals threat. That association becomes encoded. So years later, even in a relatively safe adult context, the body responds as if the old danger is present. You may know intellectually that your partner is reasonable, that your friend is mature, that your workplace encourages feedback, but your body does not live in the present moment. It lives in accumulated experience. It asks one question: has this been safe before? If the answer, historically, was no, then anxiety arises automatically. This is why people often retreat just when they begin to assert themselves. They interpret the surge of fear as a signal that they are doing something wrong. In reality, it is a signal that they are doing something new. And newness, for a conditioned nervous system, feels like risk. The tragedy is that many sensitive individuals misinterpret this biological reaction as moral failure. They say, "I'm too sensitive. I'm too dramatic. I shouldn't feel this way." But sensitivity is not pathology. It is attunement. The body is trying to protect you based on old information. The work, then, is not to override the fear with force. It is to update the system gently. When you speak honestly and nothing catastrophic happens, your nervous system learns. When you set a boundary and the relationship survives, or even strengthens, your body recalibrates. But this requires repetition. Safety must be experienced, not merely understood. There's also an important philosophical dimension here. Many of us believe that courage means the absence of fear. But in truth, courage is action in the presence of fear. If you wait until your body feels completely calm before you express yourself, you may wait forever. The fear is not evidence of incapacity. It is evidence of history. And history can be integrated. This is why self-compassion is not indulgence, it is regulation. When you feel your chest tighten as you assert yourself, instead of judging the reaction, you might say internally, "Of course this feels scary. Once upon a time, it was." That acknowledgement alone begins to soften the response. You are no longer fighting your body. You are collaborating with it. Over time, something remarkable happens. The same act that once triggered panic begins to produce steadiness. The body learns that disagreement does not equal abandonment. That anger does not automatically destroy connection. That vulnerability does not inevitably lead to humiliation. Authenticity shifts from threat to alignment. But this transition requires patience. You are not just changing behavior. You are reshaping neural pathways. You are teaching your organism that it can survive visibility. And perhaps even more profoundly, you are teaching yourself that safety does not only come from external approval. It can arise internally from congruence, from knowing that what you say matches what you feel. When there is that alignment, something in the body settles. Not because the world has become perfectly safe, but because you are no longer divided against yourself. So if authenticity feels dangerous, do not conclude that you are broken. Conclude that you are healing. Your nervous system is not your enemy. It is a loyal guardian operating on outdated instructions. And each honest act is a gentle revision of the past. The fear is not proof that you should remain hidden. It is proof that you are stepping beyond old survival patterns. And every time you tell the truth despite the tremor, you are teaching your body a new story. That being yourself is no longer a threat, it is a return. As you begin to live with more honesty, as your nervous system slowly learns that authenticity is not fatal, another layer of difficulty emerges. It's not only your internal world that must adjust. The external world must adjust as well. And not everyone will welcome that adjustment. When you change, you disrupt equilibrium. Every relationship, whether we acknowledge it or not, is organized around implicit agreements. These agreements are rarely spoken out loud. They are negotiated unconsciously over time. I will be the agreeable one. You will be the decisive one. I will absorb tension. You will avoid vulnerability. These roles create a kind of stability, not necessarily a healthy one, but a predictable one. When you begin to drop the mask, you violate those unspoken contracts. The person who relied on your compliance may experience your boundary as rejection. The colleague who benefited from your over-responsibility may call your new limits laziness. A family member who felt secure in your silence may interpret your voice as aggression. And they may say, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, "You've changed." And they are right. You have. But embedded in that statement is often an accusation, as though growth were betrayal, as though evolving beyond self-erasure were an act of disloyalty. What's really happening is that your authenticity is destabilizing a system that once depended on your adaptation. If you were the emotional caretaker, others may now be forced to confront their own discomfort. If you were the perpetual peacemaker, conflict may finally surface. If you were the overachiever, others may lose the convenience of your overfunctioning. Systems resist change, not because they are evil, but because they are organized around familiarity. This is where clarity becomes essential. When someone reacts negatively to your growth, it does not automatically mean you are wrong. It means the relational field is reorganizing, and reorganization can be uncomfortable. There is also a deeper psychological layer. When you begin to inhabit yourself more fully, you become less controllable. And for some people, control, subtle or overt, was part of the bond. If they were accustomed to your guilt, your self-doubt, your eagerness to please, your new steadiness may feel threatening. But here is the difficult truth. Relationships built on your suppression cannot survive your expansion without transformation. Some will transform, some will not. And this is where grief returns again. You may discover that certain connections were sustained not by mutual authenticity, but by mutual avoidance, by roles, by convenience, by shared denial. When those structures dissolve, there may be distance. It is tempting, at this point, to retreat, to shrink back into the familiar role so that harmony is restored, to apologize for taking up space, to reassure others that you are still the same. But if the harmony requires self-abandonment, it is not harmony. It is compliance. This does not mean you become rigid or self-righteous. Authenticity is not aggression. It is not the weaponization of truth. It is simply congruence, your inner experience aligned with your outer expression. You can be kind and boundaried. You can be compassionate and firm. The two are not opposites. Over time, something becomes clear. The relationships that are capable of depth will adjust. They may wobble at first. There may be conversations, misunderstandings, recalibrations. But if there is genuine respect, space will be made for your evolution. And the relationships that cannot tolerate your authenticity were never truly connected to you. They were connected to your mask. That realization can sting, but it is clarifying, because as you stop organizing your life around keeping others comfortable, you begin organizing it around being real. And that changes the quality of connection entirely. You may have fewer relationships, but they will be sturdier, less performative, less fragile. In the end, becoming yourself is not an act against others. It is an act for truth. And truth, though disruptive, is the only foundation strong enough to sustain real intimacy. If someone can only love the version of you that hides, they do not love you. They love your silence. And your voice was never meant to be negotiable. At a certain point in this process, something deeply unsettling can occur. You've begun to question the mask. You've started setting boundaries. You've felt the anxiety, faced the resistance, tolerated the grief. And yet, instead of feeling solid, you may feel strangely unmoored. You're no longer fully identified with who you used to be, but you're not entirely sure who you are becoming. This is the space many people interpret as breakdown. They'll say, "I feel lost. I don't recognize myself. Everything feels uncertain." And because our culture tends to pathologize uncertainty, we assume something has gone wrong. But this in-between state is not collapse. It is reconstruction. For years, sometimes decades, your identity may have been organized around adaptation, around being needed, being agreeable, being impressive, being invisible. Those roles provided structure. They answered the question, "Who am I?" in a way that was socially reinforced. When you begin to loosen those identifications, the structure wobbles. It can feel like standing in a house while the scaffolding is being removed. Without the old roles, you may encounter emptiness, not because there is nothing there, but because you have not yet fully met what is there. The authentic self is often quieter than the mask. It does not perform as loudly. It does not seek constant reassurance. It waits. This waiting can feel like loneliness. There may also be a temporary drop in external validation. When you stop overfunctioning, you receive less praise for being so dependable. When you stop self-sacrificing, fewer people applaud your generosity. When you stop achieving for approval, the applause quiets. And in that silence, doubt can grow. You might ask yourself, was the old version of me better? At least it was clear. At least I knew my role. Clarity built on distortion can feel safer than ambiguity rooted in truth. But ambiguity is not the enemy. It is the space where integration happens. Psychologically, what is occurring here is a reorganization of the self. The parts of you that were exiled, anger, desire, assertiveness, vulnerability, are slowly being invited back. Yet they may not yet feel coordinated. You may swing between over-assertion and withdrawal, between confidence and guilt, between clarity and confusion. This fluctuation is not evidence of instability. It is evidence of recalibration. Think of it this way. If you've spent years leaning heavily to one side, toward compliance, perhaps, the process of standing upright again may initially feel like imbalance. Your system is learning a new center of gravity. There is also a profound existential layer here. When we detach from externally defined roles, we are forced to confront the deeper question of identity. Not, what do I do for others? But, who am I when I am not performing? That question cannot be answered quickly. It requires presence. It requires curiosity. It requires tolerating not knowing. And this is deeply countercultural. We are taught to define ourselves through productivity, usefulness, likability. When those markers fall away, we may feel temporarily undefined. But undefined does not mean empty. It means unconditioned. If you can resist the urge to rush this stage, to quickly construct a new, more socially acceptable mask, you begin to encounter something more grounded, a sense of self that is less reactive, less dependent on approval, less organized around fear. This new self is not dramatic. It does not need to prove itself. It feels steady, even in uncertainty. But you must pass through the fog to reach that steadiness. And here is the reassurance. The feeling of being lost is often the sign that you are no longer lost in illusion. The confusion is the dismantling of false certainty. The loneliness is the clearing of space for authentic connection. You are not breaking apart. You are shedding what was never fully you. The false self dissolves before the real self consolidates. And that dissolution can feel like chaos, but it is sacred chaos. It is the reassembly of a life no longer built on adaptation. So if you find yourself in this in-between place, do not panic. Stay curious. Stay gentle. Stay patient with the unfolding. You are not losing yourself. You are meeting yourself for the first time. And then, if you persist, if you weather the grief, tolerate the uncertainty, face the resistance, and allow the nervous system to recalibrate, you begin to arrive somewhere remarkable. It is not a dramatic arrival, not a sudden epiphany, not fireworks or applause. It is quieter, subtler, and yet far more profound. It is the place where congruence lives, the point at which your internal experience aligns with your external expression. You speak, and your words reflect your truth. You act, and your actions reflect your values. You feel, and you allow yourself to feel without immediate self-censorship. This is freedom, though it does not feel like the freedom we imagined in our fantasies of rebellion. It is not chaos or indulgence. It is a disciplined form of ease, the ease of being embodied in your own life. For so long, the mask demanded constant monitoring. Every word, every gesture, every tone of voice had to be adjusted to maintain connection, approval, or safety. That burden is lifted, replaced by a steadiness that comes from knowing. What I am expressing is real, and it is enough. And with that steadiness comes discernment. You begin to see the difference between those who can tolerate your truth and those who cannot. The people who thrived on your performance or your compliance begin to fall away. This is not loss, although it may feel like it at first. It is a pruning of relationships that were never rooted in authenticity. The ones that remain, the ones that adjust, that honor your integrity, that meet you with honesty in return, become more meaningful, more resilient, more alive. In this space, boundaries are no longer guilt-laden. You say no without panic. You refuse what compromises your integrity, and you do not collapse under the weight of imagined disapproval. You discover that you can care deeply without self-erasure. You can love without losing yourself. You can be generous without sacrificing your core. In short, you begin to inhabit your own life rather than performing someone else's version of it. It is here, in this quiet alignment, that the nervous system finally learns that authenticity is not dangerous. That expressing emotion, asserting needs, or admitting vulnerability does not result in annihilation. That safety does not require compliance. That connection does not require disguise. Over time, What once triggered anxiety now produces calm, and what once felt like risk now feels like belonging. To yourself, first and foremost. And yet, this freedom is not a static state. It is dynamic. It requires attention, curiosity, and ongoing courage. You will encounter situations that challenge your integrity, moments when old patterns attempt to resurface. The fear may return, subtle or strong, and the temptation to revert to old strategies may arise. But the difference now is profound. You know what is happening. You recognize the anxiety not as proof of danger, but as a signal of history, a chance to act differently this time. You respond consciously rather than automatically. On the other side of the pain, you discover a kind of power that is rarely recognized in our culture. It is not power over others. It is power over self-abandonment. It is the power to remain present in your own life, to honor your own experience, and to participate fully in relationships and work without losing yourself. You are no longer a hostage to expectation, approval, or fear. You are the steward of your own life. And in that stewardship lies a profound peace. Not the shallow peace of complacency, but the deep peace of integrity. A peace born of alignment, resilience, and the courage to be fully known. It is subtle, unglamorous, and enduring. It is the kind of peace that does not rely on circumstances, applause, or control, but on the internal truth that your life is lived authentically, moment by moment. This is the reward for shedding the mask. The pain, the grief, the fear, the disorientation, all of it was not wasted. It was the necessary passage to a life of integrity, connection, and true freedom. And once you arrive here, you realize that the cost of your journey was never a price. It was the process of becoming yourself, fully and unapologetically. The pain was never punishment. It was preparation. And on the other side of it, you find what you were seeking all along, the quiet, unshakable liberation of being fully you.